Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Chirag Modi. I work for Yonder as an industry strategy, and today's discussion is about supply chain and sustainability. 2 years ago, when I was here, we had roughly 1/3 of the number of discussions on carbon footprint and sustainability and supply chain. We did not even have a sustainability theater, if you will. So we now have 4 theaters, last mile, which is where we are. We have sustainability theater, and the usual one, which is transportation and logistics. But to give you a perspective there, we never had this discussion, to the extent we are having right now. And we felt like this was a good, apt topic for all of us to talk about, and for you all in the audience to kind of know about what we have been up to, as well as the industry in general, and where we are headed with these topics. So again, my role at Blue Yonder is industry strategy and thought leadership, and that's really what we'll be talking about today. And thought leadership doesn't mean it's not existent, just to be clear. Everything we're talking about here has actually been working out pretty well. I'll pass on the mic to Saskia next for her introduction.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Saskia Van Ghent. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at Blue Yonder. And like Chirag said, I've definitely experienced an upward trend in the conversations around sustainability. I've been in sustainability for about 20 years. This is my first job in software and supply chain, but before that I've been leading sustainability in retail and consumer product company, really on the implementation side, and looking forward to the discussion.
And hi everyone, my name is Patty Riedel. I'm with Accenture. I lead Accenture's supply chain team across North America. Been working across the supply chain, including manufacturing, for better 25 years now. Very, very excited about how we connect the dots, not just across the supply chain, but really considering the impacts on sustainability, given the huge driver of sustainable outcomes the supply chain really is responsible for. You're probably asking what is the connection between Accenture and Blue Yonder? So Blue Yonder is one of Accenture's largest supply chain technology partners, and recently we embarked on a really exciting journey called Good Quest. So we are pursuing the Good Quest to build a next generation, really revolutionary, fully connected supply chain technology platform, and figuring out how do you do that truly with sustainability embedded every step of the way.
Thank you, Pete. All right, let's at least make the clicker work. Okay, so what we'll talk about today is really around the trends in this space, most of which you all have been kind of living up to. All of the disruptions we have talked about, all of the disruptions you all have faced together. I remember 4 years ago, right at this conference, 4 years ago, and if those of you who were here, was if day 1 is when everything was going okay, but day 2 is when we started packing up and leaving for airport. Today is really the 4th anniversary of COVID, and from U.S. shutting down at that point. So really, we have all evolved from there. We have all kind of lived through, fortunate enough to live through some of those pieces. Where do we go from here is really the questions we have been asking ourselves as a technology company. And a lot of you who have been working in the tech space and automation space have been asking the exact same questions as to where do we take it from here? What have we learned which we can apply to make us better, not just as a company, but as a humanity, as a supply chain industry per se. And that's really what our goal is, to kind of talk about and kind of bring you up to speed on what's been happening in the market and worldwide, really, in this particular space of supply chain. So a couple of years ago, I guess, my daughter asked me a question about one of her gifts not showing up on time, and she blamed me for it. She's like, "Daddy, you work in supply chain. Why is my video game not showing up?" And I'm like, "Well, honey, this is not what I do. I do this and that." She's like, "Well, I just hear that you do something in supply chain. Wasn't your name in Wall Street Journal or something?" They're like, "Yeah." So what are you doing about it? And I think that really kind of gave me a pause in terms of my contribution, if you will, and the moment in time, if you will, on supply chain, specific topics. I've been doing this for 25 years, and when I look back at my legacy and the clients I've worked with, where do I take it from here, from my contribution aspect? So supply chain is having its moment. We've all kind of felt it. And what do we do about it is really the question mark. Small, medium, big impact items. And one of the topics which continually was brought up during multiple disruptions was availability of data, having insights to act on that data, and enough human resources to actually make some sense out of it to take some actions on it. So when you slice and dice all the pieces I talked about, availability of data, right now, all the systems you're working with, very, very disjointed systems. One person in an organization has responsibility for, transportation. One person has, within transportation, one or large teams have responsibility for inbound. Another team has responsibility for outbound. And even within outbound, you got last mile, somebody else has responsibility, because we are really organized as a company in different silos for efficiency purposes, right? We are all working towards the lean manufacturing principle on that side. So how do we break down the silos? And every time I've done management consulting projects, every time I've asked all my retail clients, manufacturing clients to say, hey, break down your silos. And they'll say, Chirag, you don't know anything about it. I'm like, tell me, educate me. And they're like, well, because here's how we are organized, because our systems are actually handicapping us. The systems are not allowing us to behave a certain way in a more synchronous way, more combined view of the entire supply chain. So how do we all bring it together? And that's really kind of the area which we'll like to talk about. The challenges are fairly typical of what it used to be back in the day. We've all had weather patterns, and we've all seen, Hurricane Katrina back in the day and plenty of hurricanes before that. We've all seen inflation back in 80s and 90s, right? So none of what we are facing here is, relatively speaking, new. And I think Patty will talk a little bit about how intense it has become since then. And all the other challenges of trade wars and other pieces are asking us questions on how are we going to sustain these challenges on a day-to-day basis. Are we going to continue doing the exact same thing and have different results, or are you actually willing to do something different in order to have different results? So one of the topics for us is really, are we at that tipping point now? 4-year anniversary of worldwide COVID, 4-year anniversary of all of us kind of seeing through everything we have seen through. Do we believe what we have gone through in the last 4 years, are we ready to face the exact same situation, and we believe we are ready for it? Whether it's really your supply chain on the manufacturing side, are you doing exact same suppliers or manufacturers or contract manufacturers you've been working with? Are you buying the exact same way as you were buying 4 years ago? Are you doing things any differently on those topics? So a few months ago, I think Wall Street Journal had an article on Toyota supply chain, and Toyota basically has made an announcement very globally, very publicly, that they're building 2 supply chains in the world. One is US-centric and one is China-centric. How does this change how you are doing work? What does it mean in terms of nearshoring in the United States? Nearshoring versus what used to be the case 20, 30 years ago with outsourcing to East Asia. What does it mean? Is your supply chain going to be a little bit better because your transport time, the ocean time, everything is now going to be reduced? What sort of investments are being made on those sites? Are you actually prepared to work on those topics and optimize your supply chain in terms of being nearshored? So those are the questions we have been asking. And when we ask about weather-related questions, all the inflation and labor availability, and honestly, a very strong demographic shift. How people work is completely different now than what it used to be before. And, e-commerce is now a household thing to do. 20 years ago, that wasn't the case. So we are looking to break down some of these silos from system perspective, from Blue Yonder aspect. And what we are looking to do is really challenge ourselves to build, while we are going through that tipping point ourselves, we're also challenging the way we have built software in the past. How we have considered, a demand planner as an audience, or a warehouse operator as an audience, and a transport operator as an audience. We are now looking to do this together to say, what impact does a transport manager have if there is a stockout situation because your data was not accurate in terms of picking in the warehouse? What impact does a warehouse operator have when your truck doesn't show up on time because it's stuck in traffic somewhere and you didn't know about availability of that truck up until like 2 minutes before the loading time? All of those pieces are now being brought together with different technologies, and I'll talk about that, touch on it later on. But I want to pass it on to Patty to talk a little bit about what are some of these tipping points, the bigger drivers in this.
Great, thank you, Chirag. So I'm going to start by sharing a perspective on, are we at the tipping point? I know this is a topic that you've all probably thought about, like where are we really and why? So I'm going to break this down like a good supply chain person into demand and supply. My view is from a demand standpoint, so thinking about the demand of disruptions. It's still coming, it's increasing. We're not seeing, as you can see, in this visual, a lessening of disruptions such as political conflicts, inflation, which isn't even on here, but not only the up, but also the down. How does that impact your supply choices? Workforce challenges, right? Workforces are not increasing around the globe. So this isn't going to stop from a demand side. We're going to see that influx of disruption, I think. From a supply side, that's really up to all of us, right? We are the supply of figuring out how to deal with the ongoing disruptions. A couple of stats. Oh, I don't have the clicker, do I? A couple of stats to share. Not all of them are on the slide, so I'm gonna go off script a little bit here. So our research from Accenture tells us that only 7% of companies that have made commitments for scope 1 and 2 emissions will meet them by 2030. If you extend that out to 2050, that gets you to 18%. So it's a big gap. And we're thinking about this, of course, because we know that around 60% of all global emissions are driven by supply chains. And of course that number varies by industry, but it's a big responsibility as we think about what will it take for us as supply chain leaders, especially in the fulfillment distribution space, as we think about automation, which I'll talk a bit more about since that's why we're all here. What needs to be true in order to bring us closer to getting there? A couple more data points just as we put this into perspective. First of all, while over 70% of global CEOs agree that there is a challenge as we think about the opportunity to deal with sustainability, only 40% have committed to, only 40% agree that there is an issue with the workforce as we think about how that relates to a sustainable way of operating. So why is it that only 47% are investing in green jobs? Right, so we continue to see a little bit of a mismatch in the data between the demand and the supply. In terms of why, I want to share a little bit just around, what are the real, big rocks or barriers as we think about what's stopping us to take some of these steps. I think the first one is cost. We're all thinking about what do we need to do to transform our supply chains. Put on top of that, what do we need to do to transform our supply chains into a sustainable supply chain? Large companies are really talking about billions of dollars of both capital investment and operating cost investment on an ongoing basis. The second piece really ties into cost, which I'll frame as organizational synchronicity or alignment. Think about where all of you sit, probably in some form of a function that relates to supply chain. Is sustainability embedded in your function? I know in a lot of my clients it's not. They have shared metrics, but it's not actually set up so that you are going to your board and bringing a joint business case between supply chain and sustainability. If you are, then kudos. Is anybody doing that? Any of you going to your leadership teams or your boards and bringing a joint business case for investment in supply chain and sustainability fully integrated? Wow, okay. So that's a big deal because there's big dollars. The third piece is talent. We talk about talent a ton. I know on my team at Accenture, full disclosure, sustainability is not wired into the supply chain and operations organization. It's a very close connection. I have the head of North America Sustainability on my leadership team, and we're very close. We work very closely together. But even here, where it is so critical, to Accenture's brand to drive sustainable outcomes, it's still something that's not fully solved as we think about the training of talent across sustainability and supply chain. So I'm sure you're wondering, what do we do? There's a couple of themes that I want to bring our attention to as we think about some of the solutions. The first one is data. We talk about that, think about that a lot. There's a lot of work yet to do, I'm sure, in most of your worlds around bringing data to your supply chain in a way that's usable and efficient and streamlined and connected and trusted. As I think about it, how it relates to sustainability, the key is making data your friend to find the hot spots. So doing things like a green building audit, or even working to design your next building or to retrofit your current buildings with a green lens. Using data to show you where in your operations, not only do you have the biggest workforce impacts, but also the biggest energy consumption impacts. And this is something to think about as you're here today and the next couple of days, to ask questions of all of our partners on the floor and each other. What is unique and sustainable about your solution? Right? Where will it drive a difference so that you can make a fully informed choice? The second piece that honestly is a huge part of what I spend doing day to day with my team is thinking about the next generation of your warehouse operations solutions. My view is nothing is going to be fully automated. I know there will be a few exceptions, but for the most part, we're thinking about how do we bring together what we call the human and the machine in order to get the right specific operational excellence and clear cost and operational outcomes from the future of your on-floor operations. This is something that is going to require, I think, a lot of time. It's not going to happen overnight. It's been happening for a couple of years, but there are so many choices and so many also requirements to connect those choices from a data integration standpoint, from a usability standpoint, from a worker interaction standpoint. All of that is going to be absolutely critical, and hopefully why you're all here to learn as well as you think about those choices with the sustainability overlay. The third piece that I think is very real is just how do you measure and how do you bring the right level of visibility to help you to measure more effectively to make more operational decisions. I think from what I've seen, for the most part, everybody is measuring scope 1 and scope 2, and actually scope 3 to a large extent. But again, it's oftentimes kind of on the side. It's not necessarily embedded into all the scorecards that you're probably looking at with your teams on a weekly and monthly basis. And maybe it is. I mean, I will say measurement is something that has been happening, especially where you get data from partners, and I'm sure you're all being asked by your customers for your data, that has pushed to bring this in a more visible way. But a lot more to come. So there's a lot to do. Luckily, technology is a huge enabler. So I'm going to pass it to Saskia to talk about how technology can enable these outcomes.
Thanks, Patty. So we've talked a little bit about why we're talking about sustainability as it relates to supply chain, and just to overly simplify it, supply chain has been incredibly effective at getting products around the world, moving things really quickly, having access to abundance in terms of food and wealth. And the downside of that is that there is a correlated carbon footprint and waste footprint associated with that supply chain delivery. And what I'm excited about is how do we bring sustainability and sustainability solutions to the problems that have been caused by this acceleration of supply chain and globalization. So I won't touch on too much more of the statistics. We know that supply chain has an enormous impact. Let's get to some of the actions that we can all take to mitigate that sustainability impact. So not only have we all realized that supply chain has a huge impact, but there's a huge number of new regulatory pressures that have emerged because countries and governments have started to recognize that supply chain is responsible for climate and waste impacts. And they're starting to put regulatory pressure across the board. So you'll see from this map, no matter where you're operating, there's going to be a regulatory pressure. If you're paying attention to the SEC, just last week they finally released guidance. The sustainability nerds have been waiting for this guidance for a couple of years, but they finally released guidance that is requiring all publicly traded companies in the US to report Scope 1 and Scope 2 carbon emissions. So that's carbon emissions associated with buildings that you own, whether it be warehouses or manufacturing facilities or offices, as well as owned aspects of your supply chain. So if you own your own fleets and vehicles, that will also be included in your reportable emissions. So we'll start to see an onslaught of companies now needing to report their carbon emissions in the US in a completely different way. What I would really be nervous about, if you're not prepared yet, is actually the regulations that are coming from California. And in California, they're actually copying what's happening in Europe, which is a lot more stringent than what the SEC has recently released guidance around. Those regulations are requiring now 50,000 new companies to report their carbon emissions in a completely different way. There's also something called a carbon border adjustment that's being put in place. So if you're importing goods from a country that has really high carbon emissions, you're going to start to have to pay a premium on that import. So all this points to a need to have increased visibility throughout your supply chain, not just your direct operations, to get in front of those regulatory requirements. So this is the European regulations, and then just to touch on the California regulations, to put those on your radar. Those are going to be coming down the pike next year and then subsequent years. And the opportunity really is to turn all of the impacts that we're used to measuring in supply chain into sustainability benefits that will bring more resilience into your operations. What Patty was showing you and all of the different turbulation that we've all experienced over the past few years, the way that we can get in front of that is understanding the risks that we have in our supply chain. And the regulations are not only requiring that level of reporting, they're actually requiring you to disclose and look at the different risk points that are in your supply chain and showing how things like the effects of climate change, sea level rise, fires will be impacting your suppliers and your manufacturing locations. So with that visibility of risk, we'll also be able to identify how we should get in front of it and create more resilient supply chains at large. And then Blue Yonder, we are a software solution around supply chains from sourcing and planning all the way through now returns. We have customer returns as well. And we're helping companies take carbon and take waste out from every part of their operation end to end. So just touch on a couple of examples here. There's an enormous opportunity to use data and insights, and Chirag will touch on some of those technology aspects, but to really have better planning up front so that you avoid overproduction and waste during the planning process and manage your manufacturing planning so that you're sequencing things in a way that helps you minimize the amount of waste and water use and chemical use. From a transportation, I think this is very intuitive to us, but the more that you manage your logistics to cut miles out, design your entire network so it's optimized from a transportation standpoint, there's an enormous cost benefit because you're not driving trucks unnecessarily, but there's also a correlated carbon benefit from that. And Blue Yonder is helping our customers not only optimize those systems, but help you measure the carbon reductions from that. And then lastly, on the retail side, again, there's a huge opportunity to avoid waste through better planning solutions and the correlated carbon footprint from that. So thinking about some of the regulations and the need to disclose those carbon footprints and also look at risk throughout your supply chain, it will touch across manufacturing, logistics, and planning as well. And then lastly, just wanted to give you a couple of actions that you can take. I pointed to some of the trends around the awareness of sustainability within supply chain, and Patty mentioned the connectivity between our supply chain teams and our sustainability teams. Because of all the pressures that we're seeing, we're going to see a lot more integration of those strategies between sustainability and supply chain. And that points to a need to have increased visibility for our carbon footprints, our waste footprints, and that traceability and trust that will help your consumers understand why you're being responsible, but also help you meet those regulatory requirements. There's an onslaught of regulations. Unfortunately, if you're not prepared, you need to start getting more buttoned up around how you're having that visibility through your supply chain and the visibility to report to these new regulations. And it's really all down now to supply chain to meet those regulatory requirements. A lot of companies have already addressed the direct emissions that they can have from their own facilities, and now we'll be looking to supply chain to get some of those embedded emission and waste benefits. And then last one is there's really an opportunity to take some of the human error and human decisioning out through using technology, and Blue Yonder's been very effective at just creating automation and using data to inform how you can optimize from planning all the way through execution and returns. So really leaning into technology as a way to meet those regulatory requirements, but then also really improve and optimize and have just a more resilient plan in place. With that, I'll pass it back to Chirag to touch a little bit more on how technology can support that.
So just a quick question, show of hands. How many of you have done network strategies recently? How many DCs you're going to need? How many buildings? What size? What material handling systems, etc.? Anyone more recently? So there are tools out there, right? I mean, a bunch of tools out there which does optimization on number of miles reduction, et cetera, et cetera. About 15, 17 years ago, with the very heavy focus on clean technology and solar panels and whatnot, the then government administration had actually given a lot more incentives out. And at that time, we had actually built a lot of the carbon footprint minimization as one of the goals for optimization. So one of the variables in the optimization is number of miles reduction, amount of cost reduction, etc. But along with that, we had also built in the software tool, greenhouse gas reduction or carbon footprint reduction. And we asked a lot of our clients, like, hey, how many times do you use this feature? And the answer was never. And this is, I'm talking about 15, 17-year-old tool with that maximization of benefit tied with reduction of carbon footprint. And I think this is the part, when they mentioned some of the feedback there, and one of the feedbacks was, hey, some of the data here is not that accurate, so we didn't want to make judgment calls based on the amount of data out there. Supply chain is really at the core a data problem, really. What we are solving for is how best to get quick, obviously real time would be best, and accurate data. And if you don't have that accurate data, you're not going to be able to optimize anything. Garbage in, garbage out. We have all used that term plenty of times in our careers. And so when we think through what technology has now gone through, forget about for a second that a lot of our customers are actually not using the feature we have given them. But when we fast forward in 2023, 24, one of the aspects which we have become a lot more in tune with is the cloud technology, where the data is available at your fingertips. Steve Jobs did a fantastic job when they created iCloud. going from one platform, one device to another device. I mean, essentially, that's really what we're talking about here. And I think what that does is it gives all of us a cost-effective option. Moving from cell phones in 90s with Gordon Gekko carrying that brick with him, to us carrying our latest iPhones, which is what, 1/10 in weight and probably 100 times more powerful. I mean, that's really the change we are talking about, and those are the changes we've seen on the consumer side, but we've also seen those exact same changes, especially in the last 10 to 15 years in the cloud technology, which has made innovation a lot more quicker, but more importantly, a lot more cost effective. Back in the day, a lot of companies used to implement PeopleSoft technology for CRM. A lot of companies now do Salesforce. And it's a cloud-based technology platform which allows all of us to do things a lot faster, better, and cheaper. So one of the components I want to talk about is how do we break down these silos with some of the newer technologies where if you are tracking a customer order and a customer has ordered it on your e-commerce platform, or call it a B2B services, how do you track that going from your order management system to your warehouse management where it's picked, and eventually a carrier is going to pick that up from delivery standpoint, whether it's a truckload carrier or whether it's a parcel carrier, taking it all the way to your doorstep or a business location. How do you keep track of all of this? Technically, if you ask a warehouse person, he or she is going to look at it in the warehouse system like, hey, I picked up, and it's all out the door, here's my bill of lading number, and I'm done. Then you have to go and talk to a transport person and say, hey, here's the bill of lading number, where's my order? And then you talk to somebody else. So how do you bring all of these pieces together is really what we have been working towards and implementing with a lot of our clients, especially with the help of Accenture. And I think this is the part where we are not just limiting to the execution aspect of it, but when you think about the returns aspect, about 30% of consumer goods bought online goes back to those warehouses. Roughly 800 to 900 billion dollars worth of goods last year went in returns. Some of those returns can be put back on the shelf for selling. But when you think about, let's say 5-10% of that went back on the shelf, if you are a demand forecasting person, how do you take that into account, that I'm going to have 5 to 10% going back on the shelf at a SKU level when you're doing a production plan, when you're doing a distribution plan? This is where the feedback loop from system standpoint today is very, very limiting. It's very constrained, and that's really what we are trying to change with the help of our software solutions, where they're all interconnected, where the data flows seamlessly and real time, so that, back in the day, if you recall, Walmart used to have P&G and a lot of their tier 1 suppliers. When a point of sale sells something, they are building up an order for replenishment to those stores. It's very similar, but also now taking into account returns process as well as the demand forecasting angle. So that's really looking at a journey of an order with the horizontal of an asset utilization in focus. So think about your truck utilization, think about your warehouse utilization, think about your human resource utilization within the four walls of the warehouse. And also, from a driver perspective, how do you make his or her life easier through the entire journey here? These are the last slides, and I'll leave this for you all to kind of think through. Where do you take this from here? How do you make changes in your daily processes in order to have one of the metrics of sustainability and greenhouse gas reduction, carbon footprint reduction on your goal metric? 10 years ago, You may or may not have tracked what percentage of your sales is e-commerce. You added that on your scorecard. 10 years ago, you may or may not have tracked what's my last mile performance for delivery. How much am I spending on my last mile cost? $5 to $10 is kind of a very normal number. Everybody spends on it. You probably didn't track that. This is an evolution from there to say we are now also going to track on our scorecard. And a lot of companies have been doing it already, but these are the early adopters. We're talking about a lot of companies in Europe and Canada. They have been at the forefront of these changes. And their VP scorecards and a business leader scorecard, one of the items in their comp package is greenhouse gas reduction. In the United States, we haven't been as much at the forefront of it. And we're trying to change that by saying there are softwares and reports available which allow you to do that. So during the planning process, you have machine learning and artificial intelligence driven demand forecasting, taking into account some of the returns into the picture so that you're not producing more. And by the way, that helps your working capital. That helps with your order fill rate. Looking at it from a preferred vendor selection standpoint, imagine having a scorecard, but also tracking your vendor scorecard. If you are trying to get a new transport service provider tracking in your system or onboard them, how do you ensure what their carbon footprint is? And what changes they are making? Are they changing some of their fleet to a little bit more fuel efficient vehicles or electric vehicles or others? The making aspect is really around not just the manufacturing processes, but also on the optimized network design, but not only take into account the less number of miles driven, but also take into account the carbon footprint of the entire supply chain, entire network. And some of these are long-term decisions. You're not going to get there on day one. We all know that part. But eventually, we all have to take the first step in order to get to that point. The last three pieces, really distribute, fulfill, and returns, is what I've talked through so far already, is really within the four walls, when you think about it. We have all kind of used packaging machines, but on the e-commerce side, what if you have a packaging machine which reduces the air in the package? With the dim weight laws and dim weight pricing from the parcel carriers, it happened probably about 7-8 years ago, I believe. A lot of changes have been made, but I still visit warehouses and I still see those old machines which are not allowing you to take full advantage of those changes. I still receive parcels at home with a bunch of air in it. And eventually that company has actually paid the price for it, right, in terms of the amount of cost incurred in it. So changes on those sides would also be critical. And fulfillment options in terms of, this actually is one of the biggest topics. When you think about the delivery speed, our expectations, so Walmart, Target, Amazon have been building their networks with entire focus on delivery speed. I have not been a Prime member. If somebody from Amazon is here, this is not a ding against you. This is simply because I've never had to buy anything where I need something within 2 days, because I'm traveling quite a bit. By the time I order something, generally it's there in 2 to 3 days. If I'm not even there to open the package, what difference does it make whether it arrived a day or on day one or day two? So the goals for speed and sustainability are actually contradicting. You are not allowing the sustainability focus in there when we are solely focused on speed. So when there was a survey done by some e-commerce users, what is the most important part for those users as a shopper? Speed and cost. They both are important. So if you can make both of those work, but along with the factor of sustainability, and if you can marry that up in some way, shape, or form, I think that's the way to go. And that's just a non-Amazon Prime member talking. So you may have a need for it. And lastly, the returns, which I talked about earlier, about including returns as part of the process because of the sheer amount of returns we send back. So what do we actually need to do? And I'll have Patty and Saskia also weigh in. But when you are in the market to change any of your supply chain systems to make you efficient, whether that's on the material handling systems, whether that's on your software side, whether that's on your transport company or your 3PLs or service provider, what are some of those things you should be asking them to alleviate any concerns, future-proofing your own supply chain from some of these discussions which we are now going to have with SEC? When SEC is mandating these rules, they are going to be looking up to all of you to say, hey, how are you baking in your processes these selection items? Saskia, go ahead.
No, just to underline that, I would literally ask how your partners and your suppliers are going to help you meet those regulations and be specific to where you're operating and rely on your partners to provide that guidance to you. And another one that Chirag was alluding to is the connectivity and the need for much deeper visibility into your supply chain. So within software, there's been a history of point solutions. Maybe you have warehouse management and transportation management from different providers that don't talk to each other. Because of all of these new pressures and sustainability, we're going to see a lot more focus on that connectivity piece and really being able to measure waste and carbon from planning all the way through return. So would also ask your partners, how are they going to help you have that full value chain visibility?
I'll add one thing. As we've talked about, this is a big change and it can be somewhat daunting. Have a plan, but be honest with yourself that the plan's going to change. Right? Don't think that something you map out today is going to be that exact plan that you execute over the next 3 to 5 years. And make sure that your team knows that, your leadership knows that, but you have to start somewhere, right? Don't let the big ideas and challenges of investment stop you from starting. Build a plan, know where you're going to start, and kind of continue to revise it. And come back and ask questions about what has changed. What's changed in terms of my customer base? What's changed in terms of my investment profile? What's changed in terms of what's out there from an automation and data standpoint? And just keep that open mindset so that you know where you can go next.
So all I would say is think big, start small, go fast. So this is a phrase I heard from one of the conferences, and it has stuck with me really well. Thinking big is critical, but more importantly, starting that first step is more, it's need of the day at that point. I'm going to open up for questions if anyone has anything. And lastly, by the way, before you leave, definitely scan the QR code. We do have a summary, executive summary of this entire, slide deck. It's a 1 or 2 page summary, which is going to be available to you in a PDF file. Hopefully, you can reference some of those, statistics and other things in your internal discussions. Go ahead, sir.
So the question is measuring scope 3, and when will that really become more prevalent? You want to take this one, Saskia?
Sure. So a lot of companies already are measuring scope 3 because they've put in place public-facing goals that they have now to meet those goals that are in place. The SEC has eliminated scope 3 from the immediate rule that they announced last week, but California, Europe, have already said that Scope 3 is part of that traceability and visibility. So any company that's operating in California or in Europe is going to need to report to Scope 3. I think there's also one thing that we haven't talked about as much, which is around the consumer preferences. We know that the majority of consumers do shop with brands and companies that are showing accountability through their full supply chain and value chain, not just their direct operations. So that's also the consumer pressure and the need to have that traceability to make claims and show benefits back to the consumer that will be evergreen. So I think absent some of the immediate regulatory requirements, there's still going to be a continued momentum around Scope 3 emission reductions. And don't forget that Scope 3 emissions are someone else's Scope 1 or Scope 2, so we're going to see a trickle down of influence even through the SEC regulations.
Yeah, I think that's a big topic. If you're buying something from Microsoft on your Outlook, Office 365, that may be considered Scope 3 in some way, shape, or form, but for them it is Scope 1. So if they are making investments, then I think in some way, shape, or form we are covered there. But again, this was one of the reasons why Scope 3 was such a contentious topic for SEC to kind of mandate right away. Right, wrong, or indifferent, we are where we are there. But certainly Scope 1 and 2 will at least get us started. Anything else? Okay. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate everyone's time.